I've never personally known a woman named Dorcas. And the only Tabitha I know of is the little girl on Bewitched, which dates me, I realize. I have known in my life many Mary, Marthas, and Joannas, and I've known more than a few Matthew, Mark's, Luke's, John's, Peter's, and Paul's. All names of people in the New Testament. But I have never known a Dorcas or a Tabitha. For centuries, people have named their children after, or at least given them the same names as important people in the New Testament, but not too many are Dorcas or Tabitha. And that's strange. And I'm going to tell you why that's strange, other than that Dorcas isn't a very nice sounding name, at least not in English. Well, that's my opinion. I hope you don't have a mother named Dorcas, so I apologize. The reason it's odd is that the men that I just mentioned from the New Testament are all called either disciples or apostles. The women are called either followers of Jesus or supporters of Jesus. There is only one time in the entire New Testament that a woman is called a disciple. Only once. Only once is the Greek word that we translate as disciple used in the feminine form for a particular woman. And do you want to guess who that woman is? Dorcas. So isn't it a little bit odd that that name isn't at the top of people's lists, up there with Peter and Paul and John and Mark and Matthew and Luke? She's the only woman in the New Testament that is given the title disciple. And what that says to me is that she's special. And that she has something to teach us about what it means to be disciples. Now, during the season of Easter, we are focusing on the readings from the book of Acts. And each week we have a question of the day, I'm calling it. And so today's question is, what does Dorcas teach us about being disciples? Now, before we can answer that question, we have to think about what's going on in the lesson that we read. And actually, what's happening is this is a body of believers. Remember, it's too early in the process for them yet to be called the church, and they're not even called Christians yet. This is a body of believers who are in mourning. They are experiencing grief and loss, probably due to disease. An important member of their group has died. She was beloved, but there's more to it than that. It's not just that she was a well-liked person. She was important for a particular reason. And here's the reason. You may remember that in the New Testament era, those who were followers of Jesus, the early church, had a number of jobs in terms of caring for people. And one of the groups that they were obligated to care for were widows. Now remember, a widow in the first century had no status of her own. If her husband died and she didn't have sons or other family members to take her in, she would be absolutely destitute. And she would be forced to either beg or probably to go into something like prostitution in order to take care of herself. And even if a family took her in, she might have been abused or she might have been given just barely enough to survive. So, The early church took it as one of its ministries to care for widows. And that evidently was Dorcas's ministry. The text that we read implies that she provided the widows with tunics, with clothing. And the fact that the women are so overwhelmed at her loss, it says that they are weeping over her, indicates that she was a friend, but that perhaps she was also a caretaker. It says in the text that she was known for her charitable acts. And the scholars say that because we are given both her Aramaic and her Greek name in the text, one being Tabitha, the other being Dorcas, it indicates that she was widely known and that her acts of caring and charity were publicly known. So, Dorcas is important. Her absence is missed. She has a ministry that is important to the early church. So much so that she's later called a disciple, and when she dies, they send for Peter. Now, we don't know exactly what they intended when they sent for Peter. Maybe they just wanted their spiritual leader to be there among them. Or maybe they had resuscitation in mind. Think what it must have been like for those widows who took their friend, they took her body, they lovingly washed it, they placed her in a room, and then they left her there with Peter. And the next thing that happened is that they see her walking toward them. Up, walking, color in her cheeks, breath in her lungs, alive. Now, maybe the reason that captures my attention is I have seen many people make that transition from life to death. And if you've seen it, you know that it's startling. The change is immediate. And so to see it in reverse would certainly be a life-changing experience. But it's interesting. The fact that Dorcas has been resuscitated is not the point. The point of the story is that God is at work through the Holy Spirit in people's lives in order to bring about restoration. And Dorcas is one of those people. And because of that, she teaches us how to be disciples. So, what does she teach us? There's 4 things that I surmise that Dorcas teaches us. First of all, she teaches us to be diligent in living out our faith, to be tenacious in living out our faith. Secondly, she teaches us to be committed to caring for those who are in need. Third, and this one I think is important, well, they all are, but this one is pretty significant. She teaches us that we should put ourselves out there in such a way that we should be so connected with not only the body of Christ, but the community as a whole, that if we are no longer there, we are missed. That our absence makes a difference. And the 4th thing she teaches us is to be open to the power of the Spirit at work in our lives to do that which is minor to miraculous. That's what it means, in part, to live our lives as disciples. And frankly, doing those things I just mentioned, as well as a whole lot of other ones, as Christians, can sometimes be very difficult, especially as we come face to face with the brokenness of the world. For the last 2 weeks, I've been debating whether or not to talk about a local tragedy during worship. But I've had so many people talk to me about it that I decided that I would discuss it. And then, when we had the bombings this past Monday at the Boston Marathon, I was even more determined that we need to discuss what it means to be people who live out our faith in the midst of a world that is oh so broken. So I want to start by mentioning to you that the murders of Jeffrey and Margaret Schobert have really bothered me. Now, I do not know them, and I don't know any members of their family, although I'm sure that some of you both knew them and also know members of their family. And yet I have been really disturbed by it. And one of those things I'm having trouble letting go of. And I think it's because of what I know about how they lived their lives. Now, I'm not going to talk about the details of their deaths, other than to say that apparently they were murdered brutally by their daughter's boyfriend, a person to whom they had shown kindness and respect. Evidently, according to a member of his family, they took him out to eat, they bought him clothes, they welcomed him into their home, in spite of the fact that he had a pretty extensive juvenile record, and as recently as December was accused of attempting an armed robbery. So what that says to me, because these weren't naive people, I don't think, is that they were doing what Jesus commands us to do. They were living out their faith. And of course, we don't know why they did what they did, why they welcomed him and showed him such kindness and respect. Maybe it was because that's what Jesus tells us to do, so that's what they did. Maybe they were trying to support their daughter and maintain a relationship with her. Maybe they thought that if they showed him acceptance and kindness, it would have an impact on him and change the way that he lived. We don't know. What we do know is that their kindness was not accepted, ultimately. That what they experienced in their deaths in no way reflects their treatment of this young man, except that once he had harmed their daughter, they then protected her. And of course, we don't know all the ins and outs of this story, and we never will. But the point is that no matter what the details are, they did not deserve to die the way they did. So, as I consider all of that, it causes me to reflect on the devastating, destructive power of human choice and of imperfection, what we might also call sin. And of course, the bombings in Boston this past Monday are yet another example of that. We don't know why these two young men, I mean, under the age of 30, chose to do what they did. And who knows if we ever will. But their actions killed 3 people and injured 170 or more. and shook the sense of safety of people not only in that city, but perhaps in our nation as a whole. And we don't know why. So in the face of all of that, in the face of violence, in the face of terrorism, what does that mean about how we live out our faith? Because you see, it would be understandable if as Christians we succumbed to doubt, to fear, to prejudice. All of those things are natural responses, as well as coming up with what I call easy answers that discredit God. For example, someone said, "Oh, it was God's will." I don't think so. I'm reminded of a theologian I read named Richard Rohr, who said that if we attribute to God anything less than the actions of the best person we know, in other words, if God is less loving, less caring, less forgiving than the best person we know, then we have mislabeled who God is. So let's go back again to where I was before I made that comment. In the face of the brokenness of the world, how are we as Christians to respond? Will we choose to continue to follow in the footsteps of Tabitha, Dorcas? Will we continue to be tenacious in living out our faith, rather than being overwhelmed by doubt? Will we continue to care for those who are in need, to be committed to doing so, rather than being overwhelmed by fear and prejudice? Will we continue, and this is a tough one, to allow ourselves to become so connected in the body of believers and in the community as a whole, so connected and so involved that if something happened to us, we'd be missed? It would make a difference. And the final question is, are we open to allowing God to work in our lives, to do that which is minor to miraculous? If we can say yes to all of that, in spite of all the things that we cannot understand, then we have grasped something important about the story of Dorcas. And that important thing is this. The story of Dorcas challenges the assumption that our predicaments are not fixable. Let me say that again. The story of Dorcas, the story of a woman who is dead, has been washed by her friends and laid out in a room. And the next thing you know, comes walking out with color in her cheeks and breath in her lungs, challenges our assumptions that our predicaments are not fixable. Those early followers of Christ turned the world upside down. They were not accepting of status quo. So I guess the question for us is this. Maybe this is the real question of the day. Since we follow the same risen Lord that they did, are we willing to challenge the way of the world as followers of the way? Amen.